Cheryl Maxson, and I have the pleasure to interview Malcolm W. Klein for the ASC Oral History Project. It's March 17th, 2017. Happy St. Pat's Day.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I want to give kind of an overview of Mac's career. After growing up in New York City, or New York, I guess, he came out west to Reid College, where he graduated with a psychology degree in 1952. He then went back to the East Coast to Boston University, where he received his master's in psychology in 1954 and a PhD also in psychology in 1961. Now then he came back out to the West Coast, to Los Angeles, where he got his first job as a research associate working with the John Tracy Clinic in Los Angeles. 2 years thereafter, he became a senior research associate with the Youth Studies Center at the University of Southern California. 4 years later, in 1968, he became associate professor of sociology, also at USC. 4 years later, in 1972, he promoted to full professor, and that same year, in 1972, he also founded and became the acting director of the Social Science Research Institute. In 1971 through 1984, he chaired the Department of Sociology at USC. Also at USC, between 1986 and 1993, he directed the Center for Research on Crime and Social Control at the Social Science Research Institute, and he became director of SSRI in 1993, where he served in that capacity until 1998, when he retired from teaching and became emeritus professor of sociology. During that period of time, he did two visiting positions, one at the University of Stockholm in Sweden in 1985, and another at the University of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain in 1993. Now, over the course of this career, Mac has produced groundbreaking research and publications, including 20 books on major topics ranging from comparative juvenile justice systems, delinquency both here and abroad, the treatment of juvenile offenders, and of course street gangs. For this work, he's achieved a number of awards and distinctions. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Society, the American Society of Criminology, Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, and the American Psychological Association. He's also received awards from several different societies, professional societies, from the Western Society of Criminology. He received the Paul Tappan Award in 1995 and the President's Award in 1998. From the American Society of Criminology, he's received the Edwin Sutherland Award in 1990. He served as vice president of ASC between 1992 and 1993, and he received the August Vollmer Award in 2008. Also, he received the Marvin Wolfgang Award for Distinguished Achievement in Criminology in 2001, and from USC, in addition to other awards he's received for teaching, research, and service, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award in 2007. So before we start diving into your work, I'd like to ask you just a few questions about your history. So you've written that your father was a professor, and I was just wondering if you'd talk a little bit about what made you decide to follow in his footsteps, or did you think about taking some other career path?
I never thought of another career path. I grew up in academia, and I guess it's the only thing with which I felt very comfortable.
Uh-huh.
When I got my degree from Reid, and went to graduate school. A piece of your history that's missing there is that for the period from 1954 to 1960, I was teaching full-time as an instructor, although I was a graduate student. So that by the time I finished my degree in 61, I already had more teaching experience than most assistant professors. At the same time, I was a research assistant on a half-time basis and also working on my graduate work and dissertation. So I was typically of those days a totally overworked young man who didn't know anything better but to follow in the footsteps of academic life. If there was another life, I didn't know what it was. I couldn't imagine being a worker, a businessman, or anything else, but somebody in academia. That's what I was there for. And I've never changed my mind. And it's been a delightful life to be an academic. My father would be proud of me if he were alive, but of course he's been dead for a century.
And what field was your father in?
He was a professor of social work at Columbia.
Okay, a good role model to have, huh? So why psychology? What was it about psychology that?
When I was at Reid, I was floundering around wondering what my major would be, and I thought maybe English because I wanted to write. And then I went to a lecture, which sounded interesting, a lecture on ink blots, they said. I didn't know, what the hell. A lecture on ink blots should have something to offer. It turned out, of course, it was a lecture on qualitative analysis of personality. It was the Rorschach test. And I was so taken with the idea that you could use ink blots to characterize a personality that I called my parents that night and said, "Hey, I'm a psychologist." And that was it. There was nothing more clever than I went to a lecture and I got fascinated by the lecture. And then as I went on at Reid, I realized that social psychology was much more interesting than ink blots.
And so what made you decide to come back east for graduate school instead?
I was offered money. My professor at Reid knew Nathan Maccabee, who was at Boston University as the chair. Maccabee had been a Reid graduate, and so he recommended me to Maccabee, who was a social psychologist from Michigan. So I went out to be a teacher and a research assistant and a graduate student for money. I mean, as a graduate student, you had to have money. My parents couldn't afford to carry on my education beyond undergraduate work. So I was bought out, as we do every day with graduate students, right?
Yes.
We get the best we can, we offer them money and hope that they stay with us.
Yeah, we're in recruiting season right now, so I'm in the thick of that, so I can definitely relate.
It's an old story, and it really suggests that much of one's career can be accidentally determined.
Yes.
It was my offer of money that led me to Boston University, which led me to Maccabee, and Maccabee led me to many other things at Boston University, including the fact that as a social psychology major, as a graduate student, I found myself in the hub of social psychology in Boston, because following the Second World War, all of those wonderful people who worked on the I&E division in the armed services went to MIT, Information and Education Division. All those attitude change people and social psychology people went to Yale and Harvard and MIT. And there I was across the river. So all I had to do was paddle my way across the river to meet Solomon Asch, to meet Ron Tajuri, E.G. Boring, who is the father of experimental psychology. He introduced himself by holding out his hand and saying, "Hello, I'm Boring." I didn't know how to respond to that. So I met him at Gordon Allport. Maccabee brought Gordon Allport to a party that my wife and I gave on Halloween. I met Gordon Allport that way. I met Jerome Bruner that way. All kinds of interesting people were gathered around the river, if you will. And so I became a social psychologist in the middle of this burgeoning field that was exploding at the time, and that made me a social psychologist.
What did you do your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on social perception. Actually, that's not quite true. It was the perception. It's so long ago, I don't know what my dissertation was. It was the perception of ambiguity. I was trying to explain the perception of ambiguity in terms of conflicting cues. And I used Bruner and I used Dan Berline, the British psychologist, as the mechanism to get at how one perceives ambiguous stimuli. And I never went back to that again.
I was going to ask you whether that carried over.
That was the end of that. Finish your dissertation, that's it.
Finishing your dissertation, you came out to Los Angeles to work at the John Tracy Clinic, and your first publications are kind of things like The Paradox of Nursing,
My
work
first
about
publication
the
was in the Journal of, what was it? Journalism Quarterly. And that was a piece I did with Maccabee, who announced that I had been published with a telegram to my wedding saying, "Congratulations on your wedding and your first publication."
That's the way you learn about it. Huh?
That's what you learn. And that was an analysis of newspaper objectivity in the 1952 elections, Eisenhower versus Adlai Stevenson.
Okay.
And I never followed up on that either.
Okay,
There
but
are lots of things I didn't follow up
I want to get back to the nursing thing.
The nursing
Can you
thing.
talk about how you ended up at the John Tracy Clinic and what that was?
Well, those are two different things. The nursing publications were at Boston University in a large project run by Warren Bennis, one of those MIT people who came over to BU and became a kind of mentor to me, a very major figure in human factors and human sensitivity research and organizational behavior. And we did a project on the role of outpatient nurses.
Oh, okay.
And that's where those publications came from. And another set of things that I never followed up on either. And the reason I went to the John Tracy Clinic is Maccabee, once again, recommended me to the director of the John Tracy Clinic, who is also a Reid graduate. It's all the fellowship of Reid, if you will. And I was finishing my dissertation, had nowhere to go. I had turned down a job at Michigan Survey Research Center because I wanted to finish my dissertation first. Had I taken that job, I would have had a totally different career.
Absolutely.
Vector. Anyway, the John Tracy Clinic job opened up because Maccabee knew the director of the John Tracy Clinic, which was a clinic for deaf and hard of hearing children, created by Spencer Tracy and his wife Louise, who had a deaf child. And therefore, if you're Spencer Tracy and you have a deaf child, you create a clinic.
Absolutely.
It makes sense to me, right? That was a 2-year job.
And then?
And then I got seduced. There was a gang intervention program going on in LA, pardon me, funded by the Ford Foundation, evaluating a gang intervention program in Los Angeles. It was floundering. The director was a half-time person from UCLA, and it needed a full-time director. While I was at the clinic, people at USC got to know me and recommended me to take over that project. I didn't want to do that. I knew nothing about gangs. Never took a criminology course in my life. Took only one sociology course in my life. Didn't see why I should take a job like that. But I was trained as an evaluator over many years. Maccabee was an evaluator. And they seduced me by telling me how important this was, by taking me to a gang meeting of a group called the Businessmen, who got their name from an extortion racket on South Park Playground. Pardon me. And that meeting was one of the most exciting meetings I've ever been to in my life. As it turns out, the group was considering having a new, and what they call a sponsor, meaning a gang worker assigned to them. And there was factionalization going on in the meeting at 7 o'clock in the evening at South Park Playground.
Yeah.
So I went to observe this, and I took a seat next to the door because if something blew up, I was going to be the first out the door.
You've always been smart.
And indeed, it did blow up, and two factions went at each other, and it got very scary.
This was over a street gang worker?
Pardon?
This was over a worker?
Over whether they would accept a new worker or not.
Wow.
Yeah. And he
He explained afterwards that he had missed an important clue about who was leadership and who was not leadership, and he was backing somebody who was not an indigenous leader.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it broke up. The gang meeting broke up. I was out the door. But in front of me that night was everything I'd studied as a social psychology graduate student. I'd taken courses in attitudes and perception and communications, and most importantly, group dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
And everything I studied as a graduate student was right smack in front of me in that gang meeting. All the factionalism and the leadership functions and the communications issues and the attitudes and the opinions and the impulsiveness of group behavior. It was all smack in front of me there. And I sat there with my eyes wide open saying, my God, to myself, this is what I studied. And so I went back to my house with the guy who had been evaluating the program. About 1 o'clock at night, he was talking about the gangs and what it meant to be an evaluator in a situation like that, and telling me about all the famous people who were studying gangs in those days. And he named Jim Short and Dick Cloward and Herb Spergel and Henry McKay and Saul Coburn and Walter Miller. Mm-hmm. And he said, Mac, you know, if you're going to go up to Berkeley at some public health job? And I said, that's right. I said, well, that doesn't lead anywhere. If you take on this gang project, you can be with the big kids. You can get out there into a career with the big kids. And then he said at 1 o'clock at night, you know, you'd be chicken if you didn't take this. And my wife, who was in the bedroom packing up to take us up to Berkeley, heard that, and she told me later she stopped packing. The challenge was there, and as soon as she heard me being challenged by being told I'd be chicken if I didn't take the job, she knew we weren't going to Berkeley. And that's how I became a sociologist, that's how I became a gang researcher, and that's how a career was built. Purely accidental.
Yep.
If this guy hadn't said to me you'd be chicken, I probably would be up in Berkeley in public health.
We're very glad he did, as it turns out, right? So can you talk a little bit about that early gang research? What do you see as being the...
Excuse me a minute. Yeah, go ahead.
The core contributions of that work?
I don't understand the question.
So, you know, the Street Gangs and Street Workers was the book that came out of that series of projects.
Right.
Actually, could you talk about how you went from the first project to the second project?
Well, the
first project was an evaluation of that program where I was seduced into becoming challenged. And it was a failed project. The purpose of the project was to put gang workers into 4 large traditional black gangs in South Los Angeles. What's now South Los Angeles. It used to be called South Central Los Angeles, but they didn't like the stigma, and so they changed it to South. But it turns out, according to the data that we gathered, that the more the workers did with the gangs, the more cohesive the gangs became. And the more cohesive the gangs became, the more criminally oriented and delinquent they became. So that was a failed project, although it was well-meaning, certainly. I don't mean to knock the well-meaningness of it, but the process reversed the aims of the project. Everything you did to gangs increased their cohesiveness. Whether it was police procedures or gang worker procedures or school procedures, it didn't matter. The more you made of gangs as such, the more they came to develop that group identity and to live up to what it was required to be. So we decided to mount a second project and got funding from Washington to go into a gang and deliberately reduce cohesiveness. The model was very simple. Reduce cohesiveness, this will reduce activities that would lead to gang activity. That would lead to a reduction in cohesiveness. That would lead to a reduction in delinquency. So it was a model about how this happened that we were going to try to change by changing the activities within the gang itself. We cut out all the gang meetings, all the gang activities, all the intersport activities, the car washes, the dances, all the kinds of things that were done. All the fun stuff, that's right, for the gangs themselves. With the idea that that would reduce cohesiveness, with the idea that that in turn would reduce delinquency. We didn't want to reduce delinquency directly. We wanted to see if reducing cohesiveness would reduce delinquency. So we had that 3-level model. And it turns out that as we reduced the gang activities, we did indeed reduce cohesiveness by up to about 50%, as I remember. And we had measures of cohesiveness. And then we related that measure of cohesiveness to gang delinquency, and it reduced gang delinquency by an equal amount. So the model seemed to be working until the very last day. You want the story?
I do.
On the very last day, I was sitting in the basement of the church where the gang was meeting, and there's somebody playing the piano, and a couple of guys were playing with basketball, and there was some dancing going on, and there was just kids being kids in the basement of the church, and it was all very boring and dull and uninteresting, but it was the end of the gang. Success. And then all of a sudden, down the stairs, 2 crazy characters came down, yelling and screaming that the such and such gang was outside, and they were challenging us. And the whole place blew up. It was right back to the first gang meeting I ever saw. The whole place blew up, and everybody went out for the challenge to have a big fight. I left that basement, I got into my car, and I drove down the freeway, endangering the lives of many drivers, I'm sure. Speeding down the freeway to my home, ran into the house, looked at my wife and didn't even bother to say hello to her, went to the table and started to write, "I've had it with gangs." And that phrase has been thrown back at me every year since then. Irving Spergel, Walter Miller, they all said, "You can't say I've had it with gangs. You're too involved with it." It turns out they were right. But I was furious because the nice 3-part model that had been working so beautifully suddenly blew up in one incident. Well, the whole thing didn't blow up. In one incident got me so furious at my world that I got out of the gang business for a while.
And developed a good appreciation for how hard it is for those people working.
Boy, I believed in cohesiveness, I'll tell you that. Because if a group could be triggered off that quickly, just like that, by a challenge from outside, that's a hell of a group to study and understand. And there I was, the social psychologist, seeing group dynamics once again.
Made it into the first line of your
First line of that book.
Right.
That's right. I've had it with gangs.
Yeah, that's funny. Before we move on, though, I had so you walk into this job. You have no gang research background.
Right.
No.
Totally inept.
Criminology
totally
background.
unprepared. Right?
No sociology.
No way I should have been there.
So was that research design all set up, and did you just walk into it, or
There was no
how did
research
you?
design. There was no research design. There was a half-time director who hadn't been able to do much, and there were 2 research assistants who were flailing about, wondering what the hell they were doing.
Okay, so how did you decide what to do?
Well, the first thing I did was to take a visit to Chicago and New York and Boston. And I met Jim Short, and I met Hans Maddock, and I met Jerry Suttles, and I met Nate Kaplan, and Saul Coburn, and Henry McKay, and Lloyd Owen, and Rita Simon, and Walter Miller. Oh, the big kids that I'd been told about, right? I met with them
We're now going to start to play with.
and learned as much as I could about what they were doing, what they were seeing, compared with what I was beginning to see in Los Angeles. And beginning to get a sense for these theories of gang delinquency that were being thrown about, Cloward and Olin and Cohen and Short and so on. And I came back to Los Angeles from that trip with an idea of the kinds of data we had to collect in order to evaluate the effectiveness of this gang worker intervention. What sorts of data about gangs, gang delinquency, the workers' activities could we gather that would allow us to assess what kind of effect the program was having? And then I told these two research assistants and a secretary who played research assistant on the side, these are the kinds of data we want to collect. Let's start thinking about observations and interviews and data procedures that would allow us to do this. Not only data about the gang members, but data about the gang workers themselves, how they behave. So we developed observational patterns. We went out and we went to lots of gang meetings, observed gang meetings, and observed the workers, and observed the activities, the social activities that were going on, in order to get a sense for what was out there, what was really going on with respect to the gang members and the gang workers themselves. That's why the book was called Street Gangs and Street Workers. To the pants, you know, I wasn't trained.
I was going to ask you, had you done those methods before?
I was trained as a survey researcher.
Uh-huh.
So in that sense, yes. In the sense that I'd never seen a police record in my life, no. I didn't know what they looked like. I had no idea what they looked like. In the sense of observation of group processes, yes, I was trained to do that in a group dynamics course or two as a graduate student. So I wasn't flailing about without any ideas, but I had to learn to apply those ideas to what was out there in the field. And what was out there in the field was that 526 male and 200 female African-American gang members.
Right.
That was the new thing. And I had to learn about them and gather data about them at the same time. And the data were very disappointing.
Yes.
Because they didn't support the program at all. And that's why we had to mount the second program to try out our new ideas that were based upon conceptual notions rather than just rank empiricism. The first project was rank empiricism, which one should avoid if possible.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The point where you were ready, you were done with gangs.
I was done with gangs, and at that point, the Research Institute in which I was involved took on a massive program of criminal justice involvement under LEAA, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was a huge federal program. We took the responsibility for developing juvenile justice system data for 5 Southern California counties. I think it was 5. Los Angeles, Ventura, Riverside, San Bernardino, and Orange counties. This is a huge area with, 15 million people or something like that. And we became the administrative arm for the courts and the police and probation and parole and community development agencies.
So you had all those data?
We were preparing to gather data. We had access to the data, yes, absolutely. And my piece of that action was police activity in diverting juveniles from court to community treatment.
Is that right?
The diversion projects. And again, with very little prior knowledge, I became an expert in police diversion of juveniles. Spent a lot of time with cops. Gathered data from, I think there was something like 40, 45 police departments in Los Angeles County alone. And we collected data from them on juvenile arrests and decisions about what to do with juveniles, whether to release them, send them on to court, to probation, informal probation, or what have you. So a second career developed out of that kind of material, using police data primarily and interviewing of kids and police and others about the diversion process. And out of that came...
The experimental project, right?
Which experimental project?
Well, I was thinking about
the NIMH funded
Sheriff's
project
Department.
in which we used the Sheriff's Department's diversion program in the interest of the head of the juvenile division, a lieutenant or a sergeant at that point named Jim Cook, who
later became a chief of police in another county. he was convinced that by diverting kids to minor offenders, to community agencies, they could reduce the arrest rates, the rearrest rates, the recidivism of those kids. This is a remarkable thing for a cop to push in those days. But he was convinced it could be, and we got NIMH funding to test out that notion. We did it by taking labeling theory and trying to operationalize labeling theory empirically. Hadn't been done before, really. Labeling theory was a perspective, a way of thinking about crime and delinquency and deviance, in particular, Edwin Limmert's notions. And we tried to operationalize labeling theory within the context of that diversion experiment, in which we got the sheriff's department to randomly, imagine that, randomly assign kids to one of four conditions. Onto the court, into community agencies with a purchase of service agreement. They agreed under contract to give so many hours of service to those kids. To informal probation, I think the third was informal probation, and the fourth was just to release them.
Was diversion without purchase of service?
Yeah. And those four experimental conditions were set up, and we arranged a system with the sheriff's department in a number of their stations whereby they would simply randomly assign kids to one of those four conditions rather than using their own discretion as to which kinds of conditions the kids should go to.
Yeah, boggles the mind.
And although there were problems with the project that are not important at this point, what it did show was two very significant findings. One, if you look at self-report delinquency, we went out and we interviewed, you'll recall this, we interviewed these kids, chasing them all over I remember the kid who ran out of the bedroom window in the back of the house when the interviewer approached. You know? You had to find these kids.
Human subjects concerned.
Oh, never mind, human subjects concerned. But you had to chase these kids, find them and wherever they lived around the county, and interview them. We got self-report delinquency from these kids. And the findings showed that if you compared the four conditions to which they were assigned, self-report delinquency was exactly the same over the four conditions. The amount of crime or delinquency they reported it being involved in over the follow-up period was the same regardless of which condition they were assigned to. If you looked at the police reports, arrest reports, very different finding. The least intrusive condition, release, pure release, showed the lowest rearrest. And the most intrusive, sending on to court, showed the highest rearrest. So depending on which measure you use to measure delinquency, you either had a very successful experiment or a totally unsuccessful experiment. Which is that, you know, in terms of sociology of knowledge, this is fairly important.
Absolutely.
And it led, thank God for Lamar Empey, who urged us in the beginning of that project development to get self-report data from those kids. If we hadn't done that, we would have had a very different finding, a very limited finding. But because he told us we really ought to get self-report data, we said, yes, we really ought to do that, and we really did.
Absolutely.
And the difference is there.
So what did you make of those differences?
It meant that you better be damn careful how you measure delinquency. What it said about the diversion programs, of course, was that police were making decisions generally, and this is what Thornbury found in Philadelphia as well, on the basis of their own prior decisions, rather than on the basis of the kids' behaviors. If they released them before, they would release them the next time. If they sent them to an agency before, they would send them back to the agency. If they sent them up to court, they would send them up to court again. The police were responding, in part at least, to their own prior responses to the behavior of the kids, rather than the behavior of the kids alone. That's important.
Absolutely.
And it's important to understand that social agencies will do this. Social agencies will do what social agencies do. Walter Miller, 1950s gang learning. Agencies as impediments to success. Right? agencies will do what agencies do. They feel comfortable with what they're trained to do. They will do what they're trained to do, and the behavior of their clients may be only a portion of the factors that determine what they're going to do. That's important and discouraging.
I remember your mentor at Occidental College reporting on a diversion project, reporting the statement of a diversion officer, a diversion therapist, as it were. He said, I can't believe that 15 minutes with me won't help a kid.
That came out of that?
That was
from
Mike
Mike
McAleenan's statement.
Huh.
Absolutely.
Very valuable.
It was a brilliant statement.
I've used it many times.
that agency guy said, I can't believe that 15 minutes with me won't help a kid. Social workers are trained to do social work, and educators are trained to do educating. Nurses are trained to do nursing. Professionals will do what they're trained to do. And they'll believe that they're doing it successfully, and they'll see the client behavior confirming what they think should happen. We're all a success. All of us are successes. Therapists are successes. They always forget their failures.
Yeah.
You know? It's like I had a professor who said of his teaching evaluations.
You know I'm a good teacher because all my best students tell me I'm a good teacher. And I said to him, what about your not so good students? He said, well, they're not important. We forget about the ones that don't work, and we remember the ones that confirm what we believe we're doing.
Absolutely.
We could follow this up, going in the direction of talking about further developments in the self-report delinquency work, or go in the direction of kind of looking more at the agency responses.
Well, let's look at the diversion stuff just very quickly,
Okay.
because there were two very major projects.
Right.
One of them reported in Coburn and Klein with Saul Coburn, and one reported in Maxson and Klein with some woman named Cheryl Maxson. And these were two nationally funded nationwide studies of 4 or 5 different sites around the country about diversion. And the first one had to do with models of diversion of kids in various states and what the effect of that was. And the second one, the one with you, had to do with describing state-level legislation for the handling of minor offenders, juvenile offenders, and how that was articulated in agency responses to those kids in those states. That is, did the agency response to those kids mirror the legislation, or was there not much relationship between them? And so we developed a model that said there's a normalization response where you treat status offenders in particular as just kids having a thing and they'll get over it.
Or a clinical model, medical clinical model, in which you give treatment to status offenders because there's a sickness, there's a disturbance there within them that you have to take care of so that their behavior will improve. Or a criminal justice model where you send them on to court, send them on to probation, send them on to some kind of court-mandated process. And we look to see whether the state legislation of those 3 kinds was mirrored in the way in which the local agencies handled kids. So that was a very interesting project because we started with a model and then followed through with data collection that would test out whether the model was working or not. In that sense, it was like the old number 2 gang project. Start with a model, gather data to test the model and see whether it made sense or not. That's why I think in this context, it's important to see the diversion work that we did moved in that direction of trying to develop models, like Lemmer's labeling theory and this DSO model, the status offender model, to see whether the model made sense. Conceptually, empirically, could you put the 2 things together? So that's another piece of my career, going through all of those diversion projects.
And the take-home point?
Pardon?
The takeaway point of that study?
Takeaway point was it gets dull after a while and you got to move on to something else. That was a period in which the federal government, this was Nixon time, by the way, which is fascinating, because the Nixon law and order approach nonetheless was fostering diversion from the criminal justice system.
To make more room.
Well, no, I think they got led by bureaucrats who were more liberal than Nixon was.
Oh, okay.
And the whole diversion thing, Del Elliott's major diversion project experiment was in that same period where the federal government was supporting an anti-law and order kind of approach to handling of kids. So what you make of that is it's a function of the zeitgeist of the time. What is going on nationally in terms of philosophy and how it plays out in the community level, at the local level. But as the federal government changes its mind about things and the money flows in a different direction, projects end. Diversion ends. There's no more diversion going on these days because the money isn't there to support either the community agencies or the researchers who want to do the research on that. So researchers follow the money, and the money follows the politics. This is a gross overrepresentation, but nonetheless, that's how it works. And the gang world is very much the same. The federal government supports certain kinds of programs. Those programs get funded and supported at the local level, and researchers follow the money to evaluate those things and collect data with respect to them. You and I did that. Many gang researchers have done that. Many diversion researchers have done that.
Well, though we also initiated our own projects.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. Yes, we did. And we went to the federal government to get support for them.
Right.
And we were very fortunate in getting that support most of the time. I mean, our hit rate was something like 75 or 80%, and that's extraordinary.
Yeah,
but we knew how to do it. We learned how to do it. We learned how to write those proposals successfully. But you mentioned things we did on our own. Either I did or you and I did together or others. One of those was more gang data about gangs and drugs in Los Angeles, for instance,
right.
where we initiated the idea because it was the crack explosion period in Los Angeles. We decided we better go and get some money to find out whether gangs are really in control of the drug trade, in control of the crack trade. We got the money, and we did the project. We came up with findings that disagreed totally with what the LAPD thought, the police department, and they criticized us. They said, as I remember, one assistant chief said, "Where did they get those data?" And my answer was, "From you." Well, we never heard from them again. What we found was the gangs were not in control of the crack trade at all. There were two confluent processes going on, gangs and drugs, but they didn't have much to do with each other. But that was not the message that the public or the police wanted to hear. We did another project in which we compared gang and non-gang, or a couple of projects, compared gang and non-gang crime from the same neighborhoods. What is it about gang crime that makes it different from non-gang crime? And we could do an analysis of the data, which we got from the police again, not self-report, but from the police, to show that there really were significant differences between gang and non-gang delinquency. And then doing this project in which we controlled for the neighborhood is also very important because these were gang kids and non-gang kids from the same neighborhood.
Right.
It wasn't that you had gang kids from a bad neighborhood and non-gang kids from a good neighborhood, but rather you had same neighborhoods, different kinds of kids. You can make those comparisons. So that's a contribution to understanding the nature of gangs, because what is it that makes gang crime different from non-gang crime? Gangs. The dynamics of the group processes that we talked about years and years before show up in that behavior. Right? So that was a return to the gang issue. There was an evaluation project. Pardon?
What made you change your mind about getting back in the gang?
Goddamn challenge again.
Yeah.
There was a new program that was going to be initiated in Los Angeles based on a program in Philadelphia that had claimed great success. The Philadelphia Project, or Plan. Philadelphia Plan. And the LA County Board of Supervisors said, "Oh, we got to have that here."
Right.
And so they imported it. And as soon as they imported it, they claimed it was successful before they'd even started it. Because they
No
wanted...
data needed.
Who needs a project if we already know it works? But Jim Cook, the old sheriff's department diversion guy, challenged me to say, you should take an evaluation of this new project, please. So I got back into it.
He didn't call you a chicken.
He didn't call me chicken, but he implied it. He implied it that I really should do this. It was what I should do. And then the strangest thing happened. I was looking around for a research assistant to help me with that evaluation of the new program. And I had in mind a particular graduate student, a guy who was very bright. I offered it to him, and he said no. I said, what? He said, no, I don't want to do that. And, oh my God, what am I going to do? I don't have a research assistant to help me with this thing. And I had another research assistant, a graduate student named Cheryl Maxson.
Yeah.
And I explained my problem to her, and she said, well, why do you think I came to USC in the first place? To work with gangs with you. And I said, what, a woman doing gang research? And you berated me properly for my attitude.
No doubt.
And turned me into a beginning of a feminist. So I hired that Cheryl Maxson person to help me with the evaluation of that project, which was a total failure because the first director of the project wanted us to evaluate and gather data on the success of the project, and he spent his money on furniture for the office, and he was canned. And the guy who took his place had no interest in research and didn't want to help us and didn't want to help you gather data. So we lost out on an opportunity to do that.
So we showed him.
He got
He
arrested?
did, the guy got
Oh,
kicked
that's
out.
that's a part of the story. Can we do that tape again? I would like to. But that program in the county also led a few years later to what was called the LA Bridges Project, which was the city
Right.
developing a community-intensive project to work on the gang problem. And they developed a project that I warned them in a very strong statement that they were in trouble if they were going to carry out this project the way they designed it. And they went ahead and designed it that way anyway. And the evaluator who was assigned to it was fired after the first year, and there was never any further decent evaluation of that project afterwards, and it failed.
Yeah.
It just disappeared, it dissipated, it went into another world. Most of which didn't have gangs in it, which was one of the reasons for failure. That in turn led to another city-led program in the mayor's office, run by the mayor's office, in which the director of that project was enamored with the idea of doing research evaluation and put together an advisory committee in which we were involved, developed a whole new approach to getting agencies involved in gang research. And then he took another job, and his replacement didn't like research and didn't understand research, and that project fell apart. Even though we got an advisory committee for them, a research advisory committee for them, consisting of people like you and Finn Esvenson and Scott Decker and who else was really top-notch people to help them with it. And those top-notch people looked at the project and the evaluation proposal for it and said, whoa, wait a minute, folks, you got problems here, and they weren't paid attention to. And so once again, the politics of running a government program got in the way of the gathering of decent evaluation data and gang data to further the knowledge we have about gangs. I'm expressing here a lot of frustration with the fact that what we know about gangs doesn't get into the programs to deal with gangs. That those people who are dealing with gangs have their own agendas, their own training, their own preferences, their own predilections about what is needed and what they can do and how they would judge their success, irrespective of what kinds of data are available and what kinds of conceptual notions are available that have been worked out over many years and decades with respect to what gangs are all about.
And as long as what we learn about gangs does not get into those gang intervention programs, forget the intervention programs. They're going to either have no effect or they're going to boomerang and have a negative effect on the gang problem, which is what we found in the very first project. in the group guidance project, that the more they did, the worse it got. So there's a whole level of frustration that gets involved there. Now, you asked about where we went from there, or where I went from there.
There. What we're talking about, kind of the intersection between research and policy.
Yeah.
At some point, you wrote, I think you described yourself as a whistleblower for policy,
Did I?
a knowledge-based whistleblower.
Really?
When you talked about your
What a way with words.
ambivalent feelings about going public. So can we talk about that a little bit, about what you see as being kind of the proper role for research?
For research,
I will admit that I changed my attitude over many years of frustration. I was just talking about the fact that the data don't somehow get into action programs. And I was always reluctant to intrude, other than my own projects, intrude into public policy. Because I saw the frustration. I saw that people didn't pay attention to academics, to researchers in various areas in which I was involved. But that frustration led to anger at some point. It led me to saying, to hell with them. They've got to listen. They've got to listen. So I changed my attitude, but ambivalently over time. So I got more involved in intruding and telling people, watch out. A perfect example. The OJJDP people were going to mount a new gang program in Los Angeles. A couple staff members came out to Los Angeles and cruised around with LAPD gang patrol officers. Black and white cars zooming around in the streets, deterring. Huh?
could have been crashed officers.
Yeah, crash officers. Yeah, they were very deterrence oriented. And the OJJDP staffers really loved what they saw. They got seduced by this process of cruising around with the cops. They went back to Washington and said, hey, we got to mount this program. This is the model we got to use. LA at that point had a consortium of criminal justice people who met every month and compared notes about gangs. Mm-hmm. But what they did was to pass messages to each other about wanted posters more than anything else. Yeah. But this was an interagency consortium, if you will. So they heard about this. And I'd say, whoa, please, hang on a moment. You're talking about mounting a program based upon this Los Angeles model, which has seen an increase in gang crime and violence from 250 murders to 800 murders between 2002 and 2010, or whatever the dates were. They're going to mount that program across the nation? And I scared the hell out of the senior staffer at OJJ. And so they dumped their ideas and they put out instead an RFP, request for proposals, for new models to gang prevention. Out of which came the proposal from Irv Spergel in Chicago. There's a long story behind all of this, which is not important, but out of which came the Spergel model, which is called the Spergel Comprehensive Criminal Justice, whatever it's called. The Spergel model to gang prevention, gang intervention, gang suppression. Prevention, intervention, and suppression, all in one dose. And I was an advisor to that project. It was my fault because I stopped them from going to the LA model. And instead, Irv sent them a proposal which they didn't realize was very different from what they wanted. Right. They wanted different models to try out in different places, and Irv gave them one model. A comprehensive model to try in a number of places. Right. And he won the battle, he got the money, and that became the federal program for gang intervention and prevention and suppression for the next, well, it's still going on, I suppose, for the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. Without any data to support it. Hello? Data? Where are you, OJJDP? Why don't you? They tried to support the model and gathered data at the same time. But the problem was that Irv Spergel became the evaluator of his own action model, which is not a good idea for the most part, even though I did it in the early days. But it got very complex. In fact, I can hear Irv's voice in my head now. It's very complex, he'd say. It's very complex. I said, Irv, where's the model? It's very complex. And it took a long time for that model to get developed, primarily by somebody who was on Irv's staff, a woman named Candace Kane. And Irv would just say, it's very complex. And that complexity was accepted by OJJDP as the federal model. And it was replicated all over the place, all over the nation in various forms. The data did not, finally data were collected. The data did not support it very well. There were 5 sites, as I remember, and 2 of them looked positive, and 2 of them looked negative, and 1 you couldn't tell. So it had some promise, but nothing like the promise that all that big money would have suggested would be there. That was another example of my intrusion into public policy, which didn't necessarily work terribly well. Right? So it's frustrating.
They didn't pick up the LA plan.
No, they didn't pick up the LA plan, which would have been a disaster. It would have been a disaster, absolutely. So does that answer your question about the change in focus?
Absolutely,
It wasn't complete. I still am very ambivalent about, if I were active, I would still be very ambivalent about getting involved in directing or advising programs. I'm better at advising what not to do than I am at advising what you should do, because we don't have good data about what you should do in the gang world. Better in the diversion world.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, that sounds as though my whole career has been about gangs, and it's not true.
And so let's move on to
It's not true.
self-report.
Self-report,
I
delinquency,
got into
methodology.
measurement stuff.
All right,
The
let's
first
talk
time
about
I got
measurement.
into measurement stuff was when I tried to do a factor analysis. Well, no, I'll go back. Step -1, a factor analysis of our gang data in Los Angeles to look at the differences between core and fringe members of gangs. And nobody had done anything like that before. It was all, gang members are all alike. You've seen one gang member, you've seen them all. Our observation didn't say that. Our observation said, boy, there's a lot of heterogeneity in gang members. There are big kids and little kids and dumb kids and bright kids and active kids and inactive kids. There's a wide variety of personalities and characters. So we did a factor analysis of core versus fringe members.
And this is
The
like,
most active versus the least active.
based on activity, not identity.
No, it's based on worker assessments of those kids. Workers were very close to those boys, so they knew them. And based on information in their probation records, which had some psychological and educational data in them, as well as just the worker observation. So we were able to compare core and fringe members to each other. We found a couple of factors that distinguished them quite clearly. Gang members differ on certain factors. That was an opening, a wedge in terms of measurement for me, because it used a statistical procedure to yield conceptually important data about gangs. Okay.
Did a factor analysis of all the gang data from the first project in Los Angeles, because there was talk about gangs being specialized. It was the Cloward and Olin notion that there were retreatist gangs and conflict gangs and theft gangs. And then Spergel came through with very similar kinds of findings in Chicago. Spergel being a student of Olin's, and therefore not surprisingly finding the same thing that Olin found. Nobody else could find it, but Irv found it. Did a factor analysis of gang crime. And it turns out that there were no factors. If you looked at the significance of gang data, delinquency data, gang members were doing everything. They weren't just violent, they weren't just thieves, they weren't just this or just that. They were into everything. If a kid had a sufficient record whether it was self-report or arrest, it didn't matter. It was all over the place. And I borrowed a term from psychology called cafeteria-style behavior. I call it cafeteria-style delinquency, in which you showed that kids would do a little theft, a little vandalism, a little fighting, a little drug use, a little alcohol, a little this, a little runaway, a little that. They'd go down a cafeteria of offenses, and there were about 45 offenses that were available to them, if you will. And they go down that cafeteria and do a little of this, and do a little of that, and I started to report on this, and Mike Hindelang in the Berkeley area, in the Richmond Project I believe, of Travis Hershey, said he found the same thing up there. And the kids were doing all these different things. They weren't concentrating on any one thing or another. So I went back into the gang literature, where there were data on gang delinquency, to see whether there was specialization or not in gang delinquency. It turns out in almost all the literature, cafeteria style won. In those projects in which they found some specialization, each project has a different area of specialization. Right? So Project A found violence, Project B found drug use, Project C found theft. In other words, those specializations were peculiar to that situation and not generalizable. So cafeteria style, again, held up. I tried to get this published, and the first journal I sent it to said, no, you need to expand on this much more. We can't accept this. This is not enough. And I sent it to another journal, and they said, no, this is far too much. Shorten it way down like that. I couldn't get the damn thing published. I went to a meeting in a Greek island. I'm sorry, I went to a meeting in a Greek island with a pool and a naked beach and all of the stuff you dream about. Now, I was sitting around the pool with David Farrington and some other person from England I didn't know, and I was complaining about this. Damn it, I have this neat set of data showing that delinquency, whether it's gang or non-gang, because the Richmond data were non-gang, is this cafeteria style thing, and I can't get it published. And David said, well, why don't you talk to the editor of the British Journal of Criminology? And I said, well, I'd be happy to. Who's he? He's sitting right there.
Sitting around the pool, right?
Sitting around the pool, absolutely. So I got it published in the British Journal of Criminology. Of this article I did with Lois Crawford, the two of the most cited things I've ever done, because they had conceptual importance. I think that's why they had conceptual importance. Anyway, I got into crime measurement through those kinds of procedures, and then there's a whole new area opening up. You got 2 hours on this tape? There's a whole new area opening up. I suddenly found myself going to Europe. I was invited by Hans Kerner to a Hamburg meeting, and then I went to another international meeting in some funny little German town that I don't remember the name of, where we were talking with a bunch of Europeans about the criminal justice systems and criminal justice data. And Jim Austin from the National Council on Crime and Delinquency and I were talking about the juvenile justice system. And the Europeans were looking at us and saying, what? Is this an English translation issue? What is it? And Jim and I leapt to the grease board and drew a picture of the American juvenile justice system, from the flow of kids into police, into agencies, into probation, into court, into corrections, and so on. So this is the juvenile justice system. Well, they were fascinated. They never thought about that. None of them. I was flabbergasted by this. And so I said, well, let's follow up on this. That ended up in the book called Western Systems of Juvenile Justice, in which people from several European countries, plus Bob Carter from USC, and somebody from Canada, and somebody from Israel, somebody from Hans Kerner from Germany, and somebody from, anyway, 8 or 9 different countries, described the juvenile justice systems in system terms. Right. So we have comparison of systems, and it turns out there's a welfare system and there's a justice system. There are two general models out there that one could describe. And so after the publication of the book, I wrote back to these folks and said, listen, this is really neat, but we don't have any data. The only system description in the book that had any data was Bob Carter's about the U.S. system, because we gather data in the United States, and they weren't gathering these data in the European countries. So I said, look, let's follow up on this. Let's see if we couldn't get data on the flow of juveniles through the juvenile justice system. Or comparatively, we could do self-report delinquency across nations. Wow! Well, the answer was they didn't want to do the flow of kids through the justice system because they didn't have the data systems to do it. But they were fascinated with the idea of a self-report delinquency measurement across nations. There was a model for this already in Jan van Dijk's led program of victimization surveys across nations, international victimization surveys, to get around the problems that the data systems in the systems were lousy and different and had different meanings. Assault meant one thing in one country and another thing in another country. We learned from Martin Kilius that you can't use self-report data of carrying a weapon because all Swiss kids carry a Swiss Army knife. There are all kinds of differences between countries. They were enamored of the notion of a self-report comparison across countries. So I went for a NATO grant. NATO had and has a social science division, believe it or not. It's not just missiles. They have social science. We got a NATO grant to have a... Right. We got a NATO grant to have a conference, and my colleague at the time, Josine Jungertas from Holland, a lovely... God, I love that woman. She's passed on now, but she was an energetic, fascinating, clever, well-trained member of the Ministry of Justice in Holland. And she and I worked on, and David Farrington, worked on who we could bring to an international conference on self-report delinquency measurement. David and Josine had the contacts in Europe that I didn't have at that point. I had a few, but not what they had. So we pulled this conference together in Holland to talk about self-report delinquency measures, to look at the possibility of doing an international thing. And we used Del Elliott's measure of self-report delinquency, which was a wonderfully worked out measure of self-report delinquency based on his national study in the United States.
The National Youth Survey.
The National Youth Survey. And Del came to the conference and was kind of the point person for this whole process. And on the second night of that conference, Josine pulled together a bunch of people. Hey, we're going to have a conference. We're going to have a meeting. With all this enthusiasm. And people gathered around her and said, we are going to do a cross-national self-report delinquency study. Boom, it happened. And in the books, the conference report has all those papers that were given in the Netherlands paper. Terlo and myself with the first data from a bunch of those studies, because they developed a sampling procedure, a common sampling procedure, and a common questionnaire, interview or questionnaire process to be applied across nations. Now that's very complex, because you're talking about different nations with different languages and different criminal justice systems and different meanings to assault and carrying a weapon and theft and bicycle theft. In Europe, big deal. In the United States, who gives a damn about bicycle theft? In Europe, it's a big, huge thing. So you had to get all these things together, and we had, I don't know, a dozen or so projects carried out with that ISRD, International Self-Report Delinquency Instrument. With the enthusiasm of Josine and the contacts of David and my ability to find money in various places, we got support from National Institute of Justice. We got support from the Dutch ministry and the German ministry and my university, and then it happened. The whole new measurement issue of self-report delinquency, not only in the United States, but across nations, so that you could, in fact, make comparisons internationally. like the victimization surveys. A wonderful thing to have happened. Should I go on? I should go on to the end point of that.
Number 2.
Yeah, I'm going to skip over the Eurogang program for a moment.
Okay.
Only to say at this point that in the Eurogang program, which I will talk about, we developed a definition of gangs that could be used across countries. And when Josine and Martin Kilias and others put together the second ISRD, second International Self-Report Delinquency Project, they involved 30 nations, 30 nations, all developing self-report delinquency with common sampling procedures and a much better sampling procedure than was used in the first ISRD, far superior, and a far superior delinquency measurement instrument, translated into the languages of these 30 countries, with the same measurement procedures and the same statistical analyses done by a German colleague. And we convinced Josine to include our Eurogang definition of gangs in that ISRD2 instrument.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The result is, thank you, Josine, for including it. The result is we now have data on the prevalence, frequency of gang membership in 30 nations. And forget this business of we don't have gangs in our country. You have gangs in every one of your 30 countries. And we can describe something about their delinquency patterns because we have the gang measure, that is, how many of those kids admit to being members of a group that we define as gangs, and what their delinquency patterns are. And then out of that came a couple of articles by Uberto Gatti and colleagues, and then a magnificent article by Cheryl Maxson,
Gorgeous article, yes.
Maxson, Hemos, and Kilias, across all 30 countries, right, with a refined Eurogang definition. So we now know how much gang delinquency and what patterns of gang delinquency are out there, and more data analyses can be done with these because the gang definitions have been included in the ISRD2. I consider that a great...
It was a coup.
It was a coup. Thank you for the word. It was a coup. It was a coup, and I'm grateful for it, and I love Josine for accepting the notion that she should do that and include that.
But also in your activism, you inserted gang measurement into the causes and correlate studies.
That's also
Right?
true.
I mean,
That's also true.
imagine if
The
you
three
hadn't
causes
done
and
that.
correlates studies, Thornberry and Company in Rochester, Lober and Company in Pittsburgh, and Elliott and Company in Denver, Heisinger and Elliott in Denver. These were the three major longitudinal studies, unusual in our work, but longitudinal studies in delinquency in those three places. Those were the three that were selected out of a set of about 12 proposals that went into OJJDP. And I was, clever me, I was on the advisory committee that picked them. And therefore on the advisory committee for them as a group, because the three of them were all under the same umbrella. And I convinced them to include the gang measure, a gang measure, in all three of the projects. The result is that those three longitudinal delinquency projects also became longitudinal gang projects.
Absolutely.
And the data were there. Thornberry in particular has produced a magnificent set of data about gang delinquency in a longitudinal perspective.
Right.
So that was another intrusion and another coup. I grant you, I take pride in a few things, and that was one of them. I got that gang stuff into those longitudinal projects, and the result is an enormous amount of data on gangs that would not otherwise have taken place, would not have existed.
Can we stay with that a little bit
Sure.
and kind of get your thoughts on how gang research has changed over time? What your sense of that is? I mean, you were like at the ground level.
Yeah,
of
I
this
could do a
new
quickie.
resurgence.
I could do a quickie on that, and that is that when I started,
The project's already ongoing. We're Mobilization for Youth in New York, Cloward, and Olin. Jim Short's project in Chicago, Hans Maddox's project in Chicago, one with the Boys Club and one with the YMCA, and Walter Miller's in Boston. And then I showed up in LA with this new thing. Almost all gang research was in a single place. In fact, all of it was, I guess, in a single place, single location. And we didn't think much about that issue. But also, all gang research at that point was
It's all programmatic, right?
it was based on programs. It was evaluations of programs, which is good. No, I was going to say something else. Oh, it was all on gangs that are available to you for a period of time. If you're going to go and do a piece of gang research, you want to make sure the gang is there long enough that you can do your research. You need a gang to be around for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years so you can gather data, right? The result is that all of the gangs that were studied in those days, or almost all the gangs studied in those, were what we now call traditional gangs. They were long-standing, vertical, traditional, big gangs with hundreds of members, with subgroups and sub-cliques, and versatile delinquency patterns. And we thought that's what gangs were. They're these big traditional things. They're Crips and they're Bloods and they're gangster disciples and Chicago and Los Angeles style gangs. That's what we knew. That's going to lead us into the Eurogang area, isn't it? That was a depiction of gangs, and it was a false depiction. But we didn't know it. I didn't know it. I went to Chicago and talked to Jim and talked with Hans Maddox, and I showed them a structure, a picture of our LA gangs.
The famous turnip.
The turnip, yes, exactly. And they said, yeah, that's what we have here. And Walter Miller said, yeah, that's what we have here. I went to Germany and said, yeah, that's what we have here.
So the same everywhere, right?
That's what gangs are. Well, it turns out not to be true. Not to be true, but we didn't know it because that's all we studied. And I'm at fault for that, along with all the others, but we didn't think beyond the gangs that we were involved with. Another thing that has changed since then is a far greater appreciation for the variety of gangs that exist. One of the things that we've contributed to that is the typology of gangs, generally, first of American gangs and European gangs, into traditional, near-traditional, compressed, collective, and specialty gangs. 5 different kinds of gangs that are out there in the world, most of which traditional gangs have been studied and the others have not been, for the most part, with some exceptions. There's a wonderful specialty gang description out of Chicago, for instance. I forget the guy's name who did it now, but he got a hold of a specialty gang that grew out of one of the big traditional gangs in Chicago. And Mark Fleischer's work in Kansas City with a collective gang that he described there. But most of the work is with the traditional gangs. So that's another change. Now people are looking at other kinds of gangs and describing them in terms that we use to describe the nature, the structures of gang structures. Beyond gang delinquency, gang structures, group structures, different kinds of groups. Back to the old group dynamics, social psychology of Klein and Klein, and Klein and Klein, because that's what I push all the time. This is the group dynamics and cohesiveness. So that's a major change. Another change is that there are very few intervention programs now for researchers to hang their hats on. Most of my data and Jim Short's data and Walter Miller's data and Irv Spergel's data came out of action programs, intervention programs, which made gangs available, made gang members available. There were workers or agencies that had their hands on kids. And you could, as a researcher, go in there and use those contacts to get at the gang members themselves. I would have been lost without gang workers. They were my entry point. Look, I'm a white middle-class Scarsdale, New York PhD, for Christ's sakes. How am I going to go out there and relate to Hispanic and African-American gang members? I need an entry, and the entry is the gang workers for the most part. And that's what Short used. They had the YMCA workers. That's what Maddock used with the Boys Club workers. That's what Miller used with his agency data and his agency workers. That's where the data allow entry. That's what allows the data entry into the gangs. Those programs aren't alive now for the most part, except for the Spergel model kinds of things. So people who are doing gang research now are sort of on their own. They're sort of like Jankowski, who went out and found his own gangs to study on his own without the help from workers. Or the guy from Washington State who did a study of a gang here in Los Angeles. Those are kind of individual projects of people who study gangs. Not gang data, which you can get from police, but gangs, per se. I was always angry at Terry Thornberry because he never got to the gang structure data. He had all these wonderful gang members in Rochester, but he didn't know about the gangs. He didn't know the groups. He didn't know what groups. I asked him, what are the names of these groups? And he came up, they sent somebody out, and they came back with a bunch of names. Well, about half of those names looked to me like tiger groups, not gangs, not street gangs. It's important to know the structures of the gangs. You've got to be in the field, on the street, in some way, connected to observations of the groups, the processes, the interactions, not just the behaviors in aggregate. Aggregate data take you so far, but you need the observational data as well. That takes us to Eurogang. Oh boy, where do I start? This is the biggest source of pride I have as a researcher.
That answers another question.
This is my baby. This is where I'm not involved anymore. I can't travel anymore, so I don't do it anymore. But this is my baby. I decided as I was about to retire in the late 1990s that we had to look into this Eurogang, this European gang thing, because I'd heard about it when I was in Stockholm. And we had the travel grant and went around and found indications of gang stuff going on. So there was a meeting in Belgium on restorative justice, and you and I went to that meeting to talk about how gangs might be inappropriate to the notion of restorative justice. This was not something they wanted to hear, but we wanted them to hear it, and we wanted to travel.
That's right, we did.
And we got together with a few people who were there. Finn Esbenson was one of those. I think Hans Kerner was there.
Hans and Elmar.
And Elmar Weidekamp were there. Peter van der Laan might have been there. A few other people were there. And we talked with them about this European gang thing. And was there enough interest to follow up on it? And they said, yeah, that's kind of interesting. Let's find out. They didn't know what they were talking about. I mean, each one, might know something about gangs, but they hadn't talked to each other about it at all. We followed that up in a meeting of the ASC, I think it was in San Diego, when a number of these people happened to be there, including Sarnetsky from Stockholm, I remember. And the answer was, again, the same thing. Yeah, let's take a look at this. So we pulled together a bunch of money from the Dutch Ministry of Justice, the German, a little bit from the German Ministry, from the National Institute of Justice, a little money from my university. And Kerner and Weidekamp from Tübingen University found a place, Schmitten, Germany. Schmitten, who ever heard of Schmitten, Germany? A conference of maybe 25 or 30 of us. Maybe that's an exaggeration. Maybe there were 20 or 25. To talk about European gangs. And 3 kinds of papers went into that. One paper's about gangs generally written by Americans. Me, you, some others. And a set of papers about gangs in Europe, written by people who had studied a gang here, a gang there, but had never talked to each other, didn't know each other.
Yeah.
And this was all news to them. And then a third set of papers about other youth groups that were not gangs. So that you could make the comparison between gang and non-gang, a thing that we love to do. That led to a book called The Eurogang Paradox, Weidekamp and you. Because you wouldn't do it, and Kerner wouldn't do it, and Vodka wouldn't do it. And I was left with the task of putting this book together and making the English sound like English from all these different people in different countries. It was a challenge. The Eurogang paradox is simply this. European researchers said, we don't have gangs. Why don't you have gangs? Well, because they don't look like Crips. Our groups don't look like Crips and gangs and gangster disciples. Mm-hmm. And you and I were in a position all of a sudden there with the gang typology in hand to say, hey, you know what? American gangs don't look like that either. Most American gangs are not Crips and Bloods and gangster disciples. There are these other kinds. And we describe those other kinds, and the Europeans say, oh, my goodness, we have gangs. Mm-hmm. We have, as it turns out, primarily specialty gangs and compressed gangs. There's this wonderful paper from the guy in Holland who did his master's thesis in Manchester. Dennis Maris. A very nice creative piece with about 4 different gangs representing different types. He didn't know it at the time, which fit into this pattern very nicely. So the Eurogang paradox set the stage, and everybody agreed we got to have more workshops like this. We got to get together. More trips to Europe. We have had international workshops 2 in Spain, at least 3 in Germany, 2 in Amsterdam, I think, 1 in Denmark, 2 in Sweden, 2 in the United States, 2 in Norway. We've been all over the place. Yeah. And I think the 16th is the number coming up. 17th in a couple of months here in the United States. From 1998 to now, that's almost 1 a year of bringing together people with absolutely no funding. People coming on their own, minor funding from a ministry here, a university there, 10,000 here, 15,000 there, 5,000 here, scratching for money, but everybody coming, everybody having a good time. A cohesive group of researchers from over 200 researchers. The list is well over 200. And a couple of dozen countries, and we made marvelous progress. The first set of products has been working groups. Thank you, Scott Decker, because at the Oslo meeting, we were also frustrated in trying to figure out how we were going to manage all this, and Scott went to the board and said, all right, here's what we have. And it turns out we have a definitions group, we have an interview group for kids, and an interview group for experts, police, parents, social workers, and a working group on urban descriptors of gang settings, and a working group on ethnographic guidelines. Guidelines, but specific, not just loose ethnography, specific guidelines for each ethnographer to follow. And so we got 5 working groups with people leading them. You leading the expert survey, Finn leading the youth interview group, me leading the definitions group, Ilmar Weidekamp leading the city descriptors group, and the combination of Jody Miller and Frank van Gemert from Holland leading the ethnographic group. That was something to watch. Bunch of quantitative people trying to deal with the qualitative people. And that was great fun. Fleischer got involved in that also with us. And the instruments were developed through hard work, international mail, emails across countries. We developed those instruments and the definitions to be used commonly across countries, so that when you did research, you could compare the same kinds of data using the same instruments and the same sampling procedures all the way across. Terrific development. Then we moved on to more descriptions of the content of gang behavior, content of gangs and gang behavior, starting, I think, with the Albany meeting and moving on from there. Being satisfied that we were developing those instruments and now could compare gangs, which is what we wanted to do. Then we had a meeting in Los Angeles, which was designed to bring in new young people in particular, where each person who came brought a graduate student with him or her to seduce into our game. And out of that meeting came the website version of all of the instruments. They're now available on a website, the Eurogang website, for everybody anywhere to use without qualification, except they have to let us know what they're doing and how they're doing it. That's required. You've got to maintain the same procedures in order to do these comparative analyses. But anyway, 16 workshops, 17 workshops over that period of time. 4 books plus 1 mythical book, 1 fictional book,
That's right.
1 fictional book that you folks always forget to mention. But 4 books of collected papers and that fictional book about, I'm going to talk about it.
All right.
Street Gangs of Euroburg. I described a research project in which fictional people used our Eurogang instruments to develop gang data in the fictional city of Euroburg. And the fun thing about doing that paper, that book, was that I was able to put together all of my trips to Europe, to all the inner cities of Europe, and make a city based upon the old towns, if you will, and the surroundings in all of those European cities that I knew. And I'd been to the gang areas in those cities, so I made up a gang city and applied a fictional group of researchers, some of whom look sort of like the Eurogang people that we know, and a fictional gangs of several different types, and a fictional cop, and all the rest of it to make it come alive. That was a lot of fun. But the fun comes out of the Eurogang program because all of these people are working with common goals and common procedures and testing the edges of what they can do and cannot do under the Eurogang umbrella. And I have strong feelings about not letting people change their gangs to meet the definition or change the definition to meet the groups they're studying. And I still insist that you got to watch those 2 trends. If the group you're studying does not fit under the Eurogang definition, don't call it a Eurogang study. Go ahead and do the work. That's great. But don't call it Eurogang. If you have a definition that doesn't work for your group, don't use the Eurogang definition. Go ahead and study it. If you've got a non-gang group, go ahead and study it, because the difference between gang and non-gang groups is important for understanding gangs. Just don't call it a gang, please. Not according to the Eurogang definition. So as long as people stick with those, within those bounds, we have a great collection, 4 books worth of articles, of gang literature that wouldn't exist other than we had the Eurogang program. I've been doing it. And waking up Europe to the fact that it has gangs. It's not an American problem. Europe, you got a gang problem. Your major cities, and some minor ones, have a gang problem, and we can describe these. And we now have descriptions of these. They're different from American gangs in some ways, but they are gangs. Make no mistake about it. So that's the crowning achievement, if you will, of the career. I just love the Eurogang program because it has accomplished so much with so little support. It's based upon the enthusiasm and the interest of the members themselves, of what they want to do and continue doing. And we have new members coming in every year to every workshop. New ones coming in. Old ones dropping out. We've lost a lot of them, right? Some gone. The singing Russian is gone. We don't have him anymore with his bottle of vodka. But there are others. So it's been a kick.
Yes, it has.
Oh, I forgot one thing.
What?
I said that I wanted to institute this Eurogang program as I was retiring. I knew that I was retiring, and I had the assumption that if the Eurogang program got going, I wouldn't be able to continue as a guru of it, if you will. And I needed somebody to be responsible for continuing it. Guess who? I said, Cheryl,
We do like to
I got
travel.
this
Yes.
neat idea, and you need to be involved in a principal way.
Yeah, yeah.
And I forgot also to mention that the Eurogang program has always had a steering committee. After the third meeting, I think, in Belgium, a steering committee was put together, 2 Americans, 3 Europeans. I had to help
Something like
about
that,
a fifth figure. To act as a steering committee to guide it and lead it and make sure the next workshops took place. The membership of the steering committee has changed over time to some extent, although you and Finn are still involved. And Frank Veerman is still involved, I think. But you needed that kind of continuity to keep the process going.
Right.
And that's been an important part of it as well.
Yeah, yeah.
It hasn't had a leader, it has had a steering committee.
Finn has taken a very large role
Yeah.
in helping to organize meetings and,
Yeah.
and get funding. So,
Yeah.
it's good move, Mac.
Good move.
Good move, Mac.
Good move,
Yes,
Mac.
yes. And kind of striking to hear you talk about that as being your crowning achievement, as opposed to your work on cohesion or some of the other substantive contributions, even
Yeah.
the structures or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's been a career with a lot of specific high points, like the factor analysis of the cafeteria style and the cohesiveness and the various parts of the gang thing. But the Eurogang program itself is a movement. I don't want to sound like Donald Trump, but it's a movement.
Yeah.
I mean, it actually is.
Uh-huh.
And the ISRD too. ISRD is another one of those,
Right.
although it was taken over by other people. But I initiated it, and I take a lot of pride in having initiated it. And I initiated the Eurogang program, and I take pride in having initiated it. The fact that it has continued, despite so little funding, but because of all the enthusiasm of the people involved, that's a very pleasing thing. I mean, that says to me, I have had an impact. Never mind the impact of cafeteria-style delinquency or cohesiveness. Those are nice things. But this is a continuation of a movement, of a process within the field of criminology. Gang delinquency is a small part of criminology, but it's a pivotal part in many ways. A lot of theory in delinquency has come out of the gang research world. So to have been involved in developing something that carries that across the world, that's pretty satisfying.
Yeah.
I'm satisfied with that.
All right,
That
good.
makes me feel good. And I have all the Swedish glass up here to show
There
for
you
it
go.
in the display case.
Uh,
All the travels that have been involved have been a lot of fun as well. And using the travels for the purpose of the field is also nice. It means you don't just go out and cruise on a ship. You go out and you cruise on a ship, but you end up in a city with gangs and you study the gangs in those cities. So it puts 2 lives together. I've been in, I think it's something like 35 countries, having a wonderful time, but much of that has been because I have been funded to lecture there, or carry on workshops there, or advise people there. So there's been a combination of professional and personal lives that is wholesome.
yes.
I'm a wholesome person
That likes to build institutions.
that likes to build institutions. Yeah.
Right.
And I built an institution at USC too. That's another part that we haven't talked about.
Yes, but
But I initiated the social system, Social Science Research Institute,
right.
which had a life of some 20, 21 years before its leader decided not to lead anymore. But that was an institution building thing too. So that's sort of a kick. It's not just you, but it's you and
Yeah,
something beyond you
yeah, yeah.
that lasts. That's nice.
That is good. Yeah.
Plus a graduate student here and there.
Yeah, yeah.
Well.
So how does a psychologist come to be the chairperson of a sociology department?
Another anecdote. I was at the Youth Study Center,
Yeah.
And I was asked by psychology to teach social psych course in the evening because they didn't have any social psychology at all at USC in the psych department. And they had a visit from the American Psychological Association, the clinical branch. It said, you're not going to get accredited for a clinical program unless you also have a social psych entity in your department. And so the chairman came to me and said, would you please be our social psychologist? Well, how lovely. I said, that's terrific. Listen, I'm working full-time here at the Youth Study Center, so how about half-time, half psychology and half Youth Study Center so I can continue my research? And the department chair said, oh, that would be fine, but of course if you want to do that, you have to understand that your first obligation will be to the psych department, not to the Youth Study Center. I didn't like the sound of that. I was working full-time, by the way, through the summer, so I was a 12-month appointee. I didn't like the sound of that. I didn't want to divide my loyalties in such a way that one entity had more of me than the other. And then the Department of Sociology chairman, one-year chairman, Clarence Schrag from Washington, asked me to teach a criminology seminar, graduate criminology seminar. I said, sure, that'd be fun. I never taught criminology. I never took a course in criminology. Why not teach it, therefore? Right, why not? If you don't know it, teach it. So I did that, and I enjoyed that very much. I had a bunch of law students as well as sociology students. But that was my introduction into sociology. And then Lamar Empey, who was the head of the Youth Study Center, knew me well and knew what I could do. And he said, you know, why don't you become a member of the sociology department? They were looking for a criminologist. And I said, well, I can't do that. And he said, well, what we want is to have you and Saul Coburn come half-time each. And that'll make a sociologist in criminology, right? I said, I can't do that unless I want to keep my research position here at the Youth Studies Center. And psychology wouldn't let me do that on an equal basis. And Lamar said, oh, that's all right. Half of one, half of the other. I don't care. What the hell? So I became a sociologist. So I joined the sociology department. Well, I was a social psychologist. I can swing a little bit in either direction, even though I never had a sociology course after my freshman year, I guess, in college. And then a year later, or 2 years later, Lamar said, hey, why don't you become our graduate director? You can be the director of our graduate students. I said, well, okay. Give me a course off?
I was going to say, what the other half of your
give me a course off? He said, sure, that's fine. So a course off. So I taught one course a year. 2 years later, the department said, why don't you become our chair?
There you go.
How hard up can you be? You're going to take a psychologist to be the sociology chair. And they voted unanimously to have me do that, and I lasted for 13 years, 12 of which were good, and the 13th was a real bitch. Yeah. But anyway, it was accidental. There was no way in which I could have predicted that such a thing would happen. But I was able to maintain my social psychology self within the sociology department. I taught social psych, I taught group dynamics, I taught social problems, I taught delinquency. So I was able to maintain myself within the department in which I was a stranger in many ways. And that was very useful. Yeah.
Themes have kind of come out as you've talked, and willingness to back down from challenges, a certain kind of flexibility.
Don't call me flexible.
Accidents and a lot of proactivity. So as you kind of think back over your career, do you have any messages, advice for scholars coming up?
The thing I told my graduate students all the time was, if an opportunity comes up, grab it.
Yeah.
Grab it. Never mind if it sounds a little weird. You don't know what's going to happen. If you contact X person over there, or they contact you about something they want you to do, do it. Because you don't know what's going to happen as a result of that contact. You may get called back.
Yeah.
They may pass your name on to somebody else. When I was at the John Tracy Clinic, I was there because Alex McEachern, who was Eleanor Maccabee's research assistant at Harvard, was at the Youth Studies Center, and he got to know me. And he said, come on over to Youth Studies Center. I said, okay, what the hell? And he said, why don't you come swimming with us in the pool? I said, okay, what the hell? And why don't you talk with so-and-so over here about his project? I said, okay, why not? That led to my being at the Youth Study Center from the John Tracy Clinic. Otherwise, there's no connection between John Tracy Clinic, deaf kids,
Right.
parents,
Uh-huh.
and the Youth Study Center.
Mm-hmm.
But I was invited to participate in something, so I said yes. And then sociology said, why don't you do this? And I said yes, etc. I took advantage of opportunities, and I tell my graduate students, something comes along, don't shy away from it. Something might come of it.
Mm-hmm.
You never know. And that something could be good. If it's not good, you don't have to take it.
Yeah.
Take advantage of it. Don't stick yourself in a little hole and say, this is me, this little thing is me.
Uh-huh.
Try it out.
All right.
Dan Wilner said to me, you'll be chicken if you don't take this. Okay? Okay, I don't want to be a chicken. You know? And careers are made out of things like that.
Yeah.
Many careers.
Good advice. I think.
People do things they don't know they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
My wife is an international expert in a particular area because of accident. Because of accident. Because I had a sabbatical and she went with me.
Mm-hmm.
She ran into a research group. Pow! A whole big career opened up.
That was it.
Luck. Pure luck.
Interesting.
Pure luck.
Well, with that note, I think that we're pretty much to the end of things here, unless there's something that you really want to add that we haven't really covered.
God, haven't we covered everything?
And no, we have books that we haven't even talked about.
Oh, a lot of books. Diversion books,
Yeah,
gang books,
yes.
the Gang Reader, 4 editions of the Gang Reader.
Mhm.
That's a people all over the country, students all over the country have been exposed to gangs because of that. That's good. Well, again, the Handbook of Criminal Justice Evaluation came
That's-
about because somebody asked me if I would be willing to do it. I didn't want to do it,
Mhm.
but I said, yeah, what the heck.
What a huge
Okay.
thing you didn't want to do.
Big fat thing up in the bookcase there.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Yeah, I didn't want to do that. But it exposed me to a lot of people who were doing very interesting work in evaluation procedures
Right,
in criminal justice. People I wouldn't have known about otherwise.
uh-huh.
So it was very valuable to me, and I hope to the field.
All right. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Diversion books and self-report books, gang books, and God knows what else.
Well, it's a lot of work and a lot to be proud of, for sure.
I'm an editor of only one of the 4 Eurogang books. People have taken it over.
Right.
Right? That's very important. You and Finn and Frank Behrman and Frank Kammer,
Mm-hmm.
people
Scott.
have taken it over.
Mm-hmm.
All those funny European names. You know?
We have a lot to be proud of, so
Yeah.
thank you very much
My
for
pleasure.
this.